Thank you, Professor Feldman, for joining us on Objections. Just a couple of days before this interview, the Biden administration announced the possibility, or it was reported by the Washington Post and CNN, that the Biden administration is exploring the possibility of vaccine passports. And as a professor of law that specializes in this issue, what is it's already finding some resistance among Republicans. What does the law say about it, politics aside?
Um, I think the pragmatics say it's going to be really complicated. As people know who have been vaccinated, there's no uniform system at this point for indicating who's vaccinated. It looks to be quite easy online to buy a fake vaccination certificate. I know when I received my vaccine, I was given something like a 2x2 or 3x3 piece of paper, which looked none too official.
Right.
I'm someone who travels a lot internationally, and I looked at that paper and looked at my passport and realized there wasn't a chance in the world the border control agents in Japan or France or just about anywhere else were going to recognize that. I know a number of countries are experimenting with it, but I think one big problem we have is no uniform system of vaccine registration. I still have a vaccine card from years ago that shows I had the yellow fever vaccine when I wanted to go hiking in Peru. So there are these certificates, but nothing that's globally recognized. I think as a legal matter, I'm not sure there's going to be a successful legal challenge once there's actually a legitimate way of tracking who's gotten the vaccine. There are certainly normative challenges. It's yet another way of dividing the world between the haves and the have-nots. That's not always terribly appealing, both to people on the left and people on the right in this case. But my guess is we're going to see some sort of system like that coming about. It's quite clear there are a number of countries that have them. I believe Israel has some sort of a passport now. And if you don't have the identification that shows you've been vaccinated, you can't take certain public transportation, you can't stay in hotels, you're prevented from enjoying some of the pleasures of life, one might say. So there's no penalty, but there's certainly a kind of a bridle that's put on one's ability to enjoy certain things in life.
And part of the logistical challenges you were talking about, is it complicating things that it has become something of a social media phenomenon that people are posting their vaccination cards, which, if anyone's listening to this show, don't do that. There are security reasons why you do not want some of your private information put into the public sphere like that. But would that complicate the logistical side of things that you were referring to?
That being, would the issues of privacy complicate the logistical, or?
The issues of people posting their private information on social media through if the card itself is going to play a role in the passport, could that make what could be a very socially beneficial program that much harder to implement?
I think it could. Look, I mean, I think the issue you're pointing to is the issue that underlies some of the worry here, which is at the point at which one has a national registration system for vaccines, there are people who worry a lot about the degree to which that might be perceived as an inappropriate intrusion on one's privacy. Congress has looked at this and come close to suggesting or come close to passing or the possibility of having a national registry, but has not gotten so far as to do it in recent years. So surely posting one's private information is, I think, playing into the hands of the worry that one's medical history, one's medical status, one's medical procedures are a private matter. And to the degree that we hold that principle dear, opening up those issues to a federal registry might be considered inappropriate. On the other hand, not doing so is obviously potentially at least going to be hindering certain activities that those who are vaccinated may well be able to safely engage in. So, like everything else in public health, I suppose we're at that complicated tension between wanting to enable individuals who can act safely to do so, but not wanting to enable people to do things that will imperil the health and well-being of others. And how that's going to play in ultimately to the vaccine issue, I think, is a question. I'm sure you've seen the efforts of Clear, the airport clearance system, to partner with another organization that would create an electronic vaccine passport. That's already available in a number of countries. It's not available in the US yet, but it is being piloted. And that looks to me like at least one likely way in which vaccine authorization is going to enable people to show border control officials and others that they've been vaccinated.
So tell me some of the measures that corporate America and universities, obviously, Rutgers University has announced a mandatory vaccination for their students to get the university open. I'm a Rutgers alum, and that was welcome news to hear. There is also, I believe, United Airlines has taken that step. Do you know if any other companies have been following suit?
I think a lot of companies and universities are going to follow suit. Already, there are vaccine mandates in all sorts of institutions. Uh, I'm glad to hear that for you, the Rutgers announcement of a mandate was welcome news, but it was clearly not welcome news to everybody. And Rutgers has attracted a lot of attention, not because anyone was particularly surprised the university has gone in that direction, but I think everyone was waiting to see who was going to do it first, because this is an area where acting first doesn't always attract the kind of publicity one is interested in attracting. It's quite clear the EOC, the federal government has made clear that private employers have the ability and have the right to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine. I think it's also quite clear they'll have an obligation to accommodate certain groups of people who, for reasons of generally medical reasons, will not be able to be vaccinated, or for whom the vaccination could create certain medical problems. I think the more controversial issues around the mandate are whether other sorts of exemptions ought to be possible. 45 of the 50 states still allow some combination of philosophical and or religious exemptions to vaccines. Rutgers in New Jersey, the state of New Jersey is a state that does allow a religious exemption. And so Rutgers as a university is allowing a religious exemption to the COVID vaccine. It's not clear to me that that's the right way to go. In fact, I'm rather skeptical of religious exemptions to vaccine mandates generally. But I think United Airlines, I think we'll see in a lot of healthcare settings, long-term care settings, settings where there's close personal contact, all sorts of companies are likely to require the vaccine. And I think both state and private universities and colleges are likely to mandate it.
So, what exemptions might apply? You said that you're skeptical that students who wanted a religious or philosophical exemption would be able to get one. What would be one that would have a more solid legal basis?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that there's been some change in exemptions to vaccine mandates over the last 5 years or so, I think it's fair to say the change has been that a couple of really significant states in terms of law and policy in the country have dropped the religious exemption. That would be California after the measles outbreak from Disneyland, and New York more recently. So whereas not many years ago, there were only 2 states in the country that allowed only medical exemptions, now there are 5. And I suspect that trend may continue. And those 5 represent a pretty significant percent of the US population. So it may be that what we're on the cusp of seeing is vaccine mandates where the only exemptions are medical exemptions, and philosophical exemptions and religious exemptions are no longer going to be considered appropriate as a means of avoiding the vaccine. And I frankly think that's likely to be a positive development. I mean, the reason California dropped its religious exemption was there, in West Marin County, California, which is one of the an area of high income, high education, and extraordinarily high consumption of organic goods, but not a particularly religious part of the country. Religious objections were used disproportionately to exempt kids from vaccines in schools, and we're seeing measles outbreaks in like the Lagunitas Elementary School. And as soon as the state of California dropped the religious exemption, vaccination rates went up, and preventable diseases started to be prevented. So, I mean, you see real gains from the mandates. You see losses clearly, for people who feel strongly about not getting vaccinated. It is certainly not appealing to be told you either vaccinate your kids or they don't come to the school. That puts people in a very difficult position, and I sympathize with that. On the other hand, it seems to me we've got all sorts of reasons over the last year to appreciate the importance of valuing public health.
Right. And right now, I'm currently in Houston. At the time that the coronavirus pandemic started really exploding, I was in Queens, New York, and obviously New Jersey and New York were very, very hard hit in the beginning. And that's some of the backdrop, I suppose, to Rutgers University in New Brunswick taking that decision. You also mentioned that the state law there is more amenable to that. Can you go into that a little bit more?
So yeah, what I meant by the state law is I'm not sure it's inevitable, but I think it's generally likely that
Oh, I'm sorry.
universities.
I said amenable, not inevitable. Was I?
Right, 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 right.
Oh, I'm
But
sorry. Yeah, yeah. I didn't mean
so
to interrupt.
yeah, so by amenable, I mean that Rutgers as a university mandated vaccines and then imported the state structure for doing so, i.e., they're going to mandate the vaccine as they do other vaccines. Of course, this isn't going to be the only vaccine. Schools mandate all sorts of vaccines, but then borrowed from state law the religious and medical exemptions. I'm not 100% sure legally Rutgers was bound by state exemptions with regard to its own exemptions, but clearly that's sort of the path of least resistance is if a university is located in a state with a particular vaccine regime, you'll use that vaccine regime. So here I am in Pennsylvania. I think if the University of Pennsylvania were to mandate vaccines, they would follow Pennsylvania state's requirements, even though it's a private university, and probably allow religious and medical exemptions. Whereas if we were at NYU in New York, they may well not allow religious exemptions because state law doesn't allow religious exemptions. I got an email today. The University of Pennsylvania just announced that it's been authorized to begin to vaccinate faculty, students, and staff. And the email from Penn made very clear the university, at least at this time, is not going to mandate vaccines. It's only going to make them available. It, of course, raises the interesting question of what difference it makes to mandate. So if everyone or almost everyone is going to voluntarily get vaccinated because people appreciate the huge benefits both to themselves and to public health of vaccination, then a mandate's not necessary, right? You don't have to force people to do something they were otherwise going to willingly do. I think Rutgers is guessing that the lack of uptake is going to be a problem unless they mandate, and so they've mandated. I don't think any of us really know the answer to that. If offered vaccine, would the vast majority of Rutgers students get vaccinated? I don't know. I'd like to think so. But of course, this is a complicated group at Rutgers and every other major university. We're talking about in-state students, out-of-state students, and then we're talking about a significant number of international students coming from Asia, coming from Africa, coming from Central and South America. A lot of those students don't have it coming from Europe. Many of them have access to no vaccines at all in their home countries, or they have access to vaccines that aren't approved by the FDA and therefore aren't authorized by Rutgers as one of the permissible vaccines. So there's lots of other complicated issues here.
Can you talk about the kind of watershed Supreme Court case that has been used to justify mandatory vaccine programs, the Jacobson case?
Yeah, so if you look back in history, I mean, the question one would want to ask uh, under the US Constitution is whether there is a legal justification, constitutional support for the idea of mandatory vaccination at all. So, can states, can companies require individuals to be vaccinated, or can we only ask them to be vaccinated, offer them the possibility of being vaccinated? And Jacobson, which is an early 20th century case, followed by several other cases, but Jacobson is sort of stands out as the beacon case here, established quite clearly that under the police powers as a public health measure, individuals can be required to be vaccinated, and their failure to comply with a mandatory vaccination invites punishment. So, yeah, you may not hold people down and jab a vaccine into their arm, but you can certainly fine them. Arguably, I suppose you can imprison them. You can so penalties are appropriate at the point at which there's an obligation to be vaccinated, and the obligation uh, was really given legal power by the Jacobson decision in the first decade of the 20th century. So we've lived with that decision for a long time, which is why, as a legal matter, when the question is asked, well, gee, can anybody be forced to be vaccinated? Are vaccine mandates legal? There's lots of hard questions in the universe of law, but that's not a hard question. That's an easy question. The answer is yes. Jacobson told us 110 years ago that we can require that people be vaccinated, and if they don't want to be vaccinated, they're going to lose certain opportunities, like sending their kids to the local school.
And we talked a little earlier, you mentioned that some folks have religious objections. The Jacobson case, Jacobson himself was a religious leader, correct?
Yes, that's
And
right. Though, the religious, the reason I'm skeptical about the religious objections, and I make no claims to being a scholar of the history of religions, but from everything I've read and everything I've looked at by people who are scholars of religion and have dug into the world's religions and sub-religions, there are arguably no organized religious groups where doctrinally there's a legitimate religious objection to being vaccinated. And the way in which the religious objections work in most states, it doesn't, like, if you have a medical exemption, you need a note from a medical professional that explains what it is about your medical state that makes a vaccination inappropriate. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest that those are never fudged. Surely they are, but for the most part, I think we can have some confidence in the medical profession's integrity in providing those letters to people who deserve them. At the very least, it doesn't enable you or me or anybody else just to say, I have a medical exemption. You need some support and some backup. With a religious exemption, all I really need to do is mumble the word religion and objection, and that's it. I don't have to say what the nature of the religious objection is. I don't have to say what body of religious thought governs my personal behavior and beliefs. I don't have to cite to any religious text. All I have to do is say I have a religious objection, which means that it's the point of no resistance for anyone who doesn't want to be vaccinated for any reason they might have. All they need to intone is the words religious objection. Now, that doesn't strike me as a particularly rigorous test. And I think if the test were more rigorous and said, well, you need to explain to us exactly what it is, A, that's probably an inappropriate intrusion on people's private religious beliefs and practices. And B, it's not clear to me anyone could credibly do that when we look across religious doctrine. So I just don't see the justification for it. And what I do see is the abuse of religious objection, which has led in some places to really high rates of vaccine refusal. And as a result, outbreaks of diseases that could have been prevented by vaccines had those religious objections not been made.
And you noted a little bit earlier that Jacobson, the idea of mandatory vaccines that was settled more than a century ago. What is less settled on this landscape? What remains to be explored under the law that in this very partisan climate and the culture war surrounding vaccines, what's likely to hit the courts that courts will have to grapple with now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things. One, remember one of the extraordinary achievements of the past year has been the rapidity with which the COVID-19 vaccines have been developed. I think before this vaccine, the fastest development of a vaccine ever was for mumps, and it took 4 years. So developing a vaccine to COVID within a year is just a remarkable scientific achievement. But the FDA approved these vaccines under what's called the Emergency Authorization. So you'll see the acronym EUA thrown around a lot. That means the FDA determined that these vaccines were safe and effective, but did so with somewhat less data than it would ordinarily like. And there's no precedent for whether, there's no real, at this point, answer to the question of whether or not a vaccine that's approved under an emergency use authorization can be mandated. It's unambiguous that one that's been fully approved by the FDA can be mandated, and likely that full approval from the FDA of at least some of the vaccines will be forthcoming at some point in the next several months. But until it is, there's at least an open legal question as to whether the vaccines under their current approval status can be mandated. I think the answer is likely to be they can. Most of the other legal commentators whose work and thoughts I respect have also said they think it can, but there's certainly some who think it can't, and that's likely to be litigated. It may be by the time the litigation is winding its way through the courts, FDA has given its final approval, but that's an open legal question. I think another open legal question is there are inevitably people who will get vaccinated and soon after vaccination have a heart attack, have a stroke, develop autism, suffer paralysis, suffer all sorts of other horrible medical ailments. And it will be tempting and probably inevitable for some of them to make a causal connection and assume somehow that the vaccine is responsible for was the cause of the medical condition that they've suffered. We have a variety of programs in the federal government, both under the PrEP program for emergencies and under vaccine compensation that offer legal protection to the vaccine manufacturers in the event of adverse outcomes, and provide some compensation to people who are able to establish a legitimate causal link between the vaccine and the outcome. But I would imagine that somebody who is required to be vaccinated by a university and then suffers a terrible harm will sue that university and say you're responsible for this terrible medical condition, and that's going to be a long and complicated lawsuit. I think we know enough at this point to be reasonably skeptical about claims that the COVID-19 vaccine has caused a long list of serious problems. There's a lot of people who've gotten vaccinated at this point. We have a pretty good sense of what the negative consequences are, and they seem to be relatively manageable so far. But I think there too, we're likely to see some litigation.
Right. And we've seen litigation over similar cases in the past, alleging causal connections. These lawsuits have been unsuccessful for the reason that the science just doesn't back it up. And yet it sustains a public dialogue alleging that connection. Do you think that that's going to be an issue once this starts happening? Will the flood of litigation making those claims cause public fear and public doubt about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines?
I hope not. As I'm sure you know, the controversy over the link between the MMR vaccine and autism largely depended upon an article published in a highly respected medical journal that supposedly provided evidence for the link between the vaccine and autism, an article that was instrumental in fueling, energizing the anti-vaccine movement in this country, but an article that ultimately was retracted by the journal because it was shown to have been based on fraudulent data. There was no there in the article. Uh, but that turned out to not matter in the end. The movement had gathered so much steam. The fact that at its foundation was a bunch of lies somehow didn't reverse the tide of the movement for a while. I think it was also important that almost all of those cases involved kids who were vaccinated and involved lawsuits brought by distraught parents who saw their kids vaccinated, then experienced their kids being diagnosed with autism and were looking for some outlet to blame. They were frustrated, and as a parent, I can certainly sympathize with what a difficult position parents in that situation found themselves to be in, and sort of the desperation which they sought some way of controlling the situation by turning against the vaccine world. I think we're in a very different place with the COVID vaccine. I haven't seen anything like the Wakefield paper suggesting a scientific link between the COVID-19 vaccine and I don't know, respiratory failure or any other medical condition we may want to gin up. Uh, and over the past, I don't know, 5-10 years or so, I think we've seen something of a weakening of the anti-vaccine movement, particularly as we've seen outbreaks of vaccine preventable diseases, changes in state laws, and a reduction in those diseases. So I'm hopeful that the anti-vax movement and the really powerful political forces that have pushed it and sustained it are going to have some real lack of wind in their sails when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine, which looks to be spectacularly effective and really quite fundamentally safe at this point.
Thank you very much, Professor, for all of your time and expertise and in tackling these important issues.